In this lesson, we're going to continue building up our skin by discussing our light source and blocking in our midtones. So let's go ahead and get started. So in the previous lesson, we mixed some colors here and came up with our base tone and applied that to our sketch here. Now if we look real quick over here in our layers panel, you'll notice that I've added a layer mask to that layer containing my base tone. And basically, once I cleaned up the edges, I made a selection of all these pixels, and then just hitting this little rectangle down here at the bottom of my layers panel has a little bitty circle in the center of it, and that just applies a layer mask. And I've made a copy of that layer mask on the layer above, which I've titled midtones. So if you're unfamiliar with layer masks, this is basically going to allow me to be very cavalier and free when applying and blocking anything else over this base tone. I won't have to worry about going outside the confines of the line work here or this base tone. So if you want to know more about layer masks, be sure to check out our Introduction to Photoshop course. So what we're ready to do now is begin taking this base tone and mixing up probably about 4 different midtones to begin blocking them in over this base tone. So what are the midtones? Well, they're basically the colors that make up the actual color of the skin. Right? So that's what we're going to be focusing on, is getting a nice medium range of midtones. We're going to be thinking about the value of each tone. We don't want them to be too dark or too light. We just want a nice medium range values there. So you'll notice, with that said, over in my palette group, I've created a new layer which I've titled Midtones, appropriately enough. And let's go ahead and turn on the visibility of that. And you can see I've already got it started. I've started with this first midtone. And what I've done is I've sampled from my base tone, and I've worked in a little bit of darker red, a little bit of yellow, just to kind of get us started with that first midtone. Now as we begin taking this, we're going to sample it and basically begin making it a little bit lighter as we go down for our midtones. Now keep in mind that these tones that we're creating aren't the be-all, end-all tones that you have to use. Again, as I mentioned in the previous lesson, everyone's skin is different. So you may want to just kind of experiment a little bit. You know, grab a friend or a family member and kind of start to search for some colors that you see in their skin. Now when I made this first midtone, I worked in some reds and some oranges. I kind of took it down and muted it just a little bit by bringing in some blue. But I started with some reds because we're painting a Caucasian light-skinned female, and I'm imagining there being a lot of pinks and reds in the flesh initially. So that's kind of my reasoning of starting with adding some red in. So what I've done is I've sampled this first midtone, and I'm just putting it down another tone right next to it. And we may want to lighten it up just a little bit. I'm bringing in some of that light pastel yellow. And I'm just lighting it up a little bit. Now my brush tip, in case you're wondering, I've got it set to transfer over my brush panel. And for my opacity and flow under this transfer setting, I've got each one of these set to pen pressure. Again, this just allows me control in mixing these colors. So we've got our second midtone here. It's just a little bit lighter, kind of just working on that there. Let's go ahead and sample that, and we'll go ahead and create another one. Now, as I said in the previous lesson, often the mistake that happens when painting skin is you'll take a single color and you're creating just a variety of different values based off of just that one color, and you don't want to do that because that's going to give your skin a very lifeless, flat look. And so as we begin to mix our midtones, our shadow tones, our highlights, we're thinking about introducing other colors that's going to bring life to our subject. So mixing this third midtone here, I may want to bring in a little bit of a light green, I think. Just a little. Our skin actually has a lot of green and a lot of blue. It's very evident in Caucasians. This is because we have a lot of blue veins underneath our skin. Now, you may see those sometimes around the corners of your eyes, over here on the sides of the head. Just real subtle. Like for some people, it's very apparent. But they are there, and that does give us a little bit of those different hues of blue and green sometimes in our skin. So I'm thinking about that as I mix these different midtones. And you notice I brought a little bit of that background green in there as well. Again, the background, your environment, is going to affect how your skin comes out when you're painting it. because the skin is very translucent, it's very reflective, it's going to absorb a lot of its surroundings. Now, how you balance all that can be tricky. It's key because you don't want your skin to feel overpowered by too many highlights or too many shadows. It's a fine balance, and it does take a lot of time, a lot of experimentation, a lot of practice. So I'm bringing in a little bit of a light blue for this fourth mid-tone here. And I may just want to kind of come back through, just bring a little bit of that first mid-tone throughout these. But I think we're at a nice starting point, I think. We're getting pretty close to where I think we can begin blocking in these midtones. So just bringing in a little bit more that light red in there. All right, I think we're pretty close. All right, so what we want to do now is, before we just start blocking in these different midtones, we got to ask ourselves, okay, what's the lighting situation going on here? You want to think about that before you start slapping different areas of color on here. You want to make sure you're very clear on where your light source is coming from. So in the previous lesson, you may have noticed this layer over here right beneath our sketch layer, which is titled light source. So let's go ahead and just turn on that visibility of that layer. Now, ideally, it would have been awesome when I turned that on if it just, bam, slapped the light source and made the light very evident on our subject here, but it's not that easy. All this contains is basically some information of the lighting scheme that we have going on. It's basically a 3-point lighting scheme. We're going to have some fill light coming up here from the top. Our key light's going to be over here on the screen right, and on the screen left we're going to have kind of a backlight going on. And so keeping that in mind, I'm going to use that idea of the light source, the lighting situation, when blocking in my midtones. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this second midtone here, and I'm going to switch back over here to my brush panel. I'm going to turn off transfer. I'm going to turn on shape dynamics so I can just control the tip of my brush. I don't need transfer anymore because I don't want to control the opacity and flow. As I mentioned in the previous lesson, when you're applying your base tone and your shadow tones and your midtones, let's do that at full opacity. This is going to create a really nice foundation for your skin. Now, it's when you get into adding your highlights and things like that, you can really play around with the opacity of those, because that's going to allow you to create the illusion of that translucency of the skin, of that reflectiveness that's in the skin. So I'm thinking about the light coming from over here on the screen right first. I'm just kind of blocking in. I'm not trying to get detailed or too super accurate with all this just yet. I'm just trying to kind of ballpark idea of where I'm going to have just some of these base, these midtones applied on my base tone. So just coming around here real quickly, and as you can see, we're just working that in. Now, one thing I have made a dire mistake on is I've placed all these midtones on my midtone palette layer, and that's terrible. You don't want to do that. So let's actually go ahead and take just a couple of steps back. Luckily, we didn't get too terribly far, but what we want to do is actually go to our midtones layer in our skin blocking group. So be careful about that. And if you ever get worried about working on the wrong layer, if you think you're going to do that, just go ahead and lock that layer. So let's go ahead and do that. So jumping down to our skin blocking group, we'll work on our midtones layer. So once again, let's go ahead and work that in. It happens to all of us. It happens to the best artists in the world when working in Photoshop, is you can sometimes work on the wrong layer. So if you think that's going to be an issue, just be mindful, be careful. Luckily, we caught that pretty early on. So again, we're just coming back around here, working in this. We're thinking about the lighting scheme as I block in some of these midtones here. I'm thinking about the light again coming from the screen right. Now, you may, if you're painting a person, you may want to have some photo reference, or you may want to have someone you're looking at. Sometimes it helps rather than just making it up on the fly. But if you're familiar with people and the constructions of their face, how they're built, then you'll go have at it. But sometimes it does help to have a photo reference, so don't be shy about that. Don't ever be afraid of having some sort of reference to work from. All right, so we're just kind of coming around, blocking in these midtones here. And I'm kind of thinking about the lighting and how it'll affect the neck over here. All right, let's go ahead and grab that first midtone that we have down here, a little bit of a darker one. I'm just holding down Alt and sampling that. We're just kind of working that in, thinking about the lighting, this 3-point lighting that we're going for. Kind of coming around to some of these darker areas here. Again, just trying to create a good solid foundation that we can build from. Now, in the next lesson, what we're going to do is begin blocking in some of our shadow tones. So we're going to have another row down here of just our shadow tones and even our highlights, which will work in eventually as well. So we've pretty well got a majority of our midtones worked in here. Let's go ahead and just zoom out real quick. And I think we're ready to go ahead and begin working in these additional tones. So that's what we'll do in the next lesson, is we'll begin working in our shadow tones. So we'll see you then. In this lesson, we're going to continue building up our skin tones by blocking in some darker shadow tones. And we'll follow that up by blending those darker tones in with our mid and base tones. So let's go ahead and dive back in. So in the previous lesson, we went through and blended our different midtones here and started blocking that into our light-skinned Caucasian female. So now we're at a point where we want to start working in some darker shadow tones. Now, if you draw your attention over to our layers panel in our palette group, I've gone ahead and blended those different, or mixed those different tones for our shadow tones, our highlight tones, and our warm tones. And I took the same approach and mindset that I did with our midtones in mixing these different tones. So for our shadow tones, the first color that comes to my mind, again, we're thinking about creating a light-skinned Caucasian female. The first colors that come to my mind are reds and oranges and yellows. So I kept that in mind as I mixed each one of these different shadow tones. And the same principles applied, or the same mindset applied, when I mix these different highlight tones. Often the mistake we make when adding highlights is we tend to just use white. The problem with that is it can give your subject kind of an artificial plastic look. But there's a lot of color in light. And so you can see I've worked in some yellows, some blues, some greens, some pink. And we're going to experiment in applying those later on in the course. So with that said, let's go ahead and start blocking in our shadow tones. Now I'm going to go ahead and collapse my group for my palette just to free up some space. And on my shadows layer that I've gone ahead and added in my skin blocking group, making sure we're clicked on that, we'll go ahead and start. Now, one last thing I do want to check over here in my brush panel is I want to make sure transfer's turned off. I just want to apply this at full opacity, these shadows, just as I did with my midtones and base tones. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with this one right here. And just zooming in, let's go ahead and start with the nose area. So the shadows are basically areas where light isn't going to penetrate. It's going to be the darkest areas. So I'm just kind of trying to think about that. Again, let's go ahead and zoom out and click on our light source just to recap on our lighting scheme. Our lighting scheme is a kind of a 3-point lighting. We've got a fill light up here at the top, our key light over here to the screen right. Kind of imagine that back a ways just a little bit. And then our backlight over here to the screen left. Now, we want to make sure that our lighting in our mind isn't aiming to be a really harsh, strong light. We're really going for something that's kind of diffused and soft, because we are painting a female. That would just be more appropriate. Now, if we were painting a male, we could probably push that a little bit more and have a little bit more harsher or extreme lighting like that. But for our female, we want to keep it soft to really kind of add that elegance to the overall appearance of the skin. Now, I'm just going to use this dark shadow tone also as an opportunity just to get a stronger base for things like the eyebrows and the eyelashes, which are going to be pretty dark anyway. Same thing with the pupils here. We'll just go ahead and make those a little darker. I'm just coming around some different areas where I think light won't penetrate. And just working in some of these darker tones. Namely over here in the ear. We got some crevices over here where the light's not going to hit too well. And I'm thinking about this area underneath the chin. We're probably going to have a shadow right there. And again, these don't have to be perfect. Just like our base tone and our mid-tone, we're just kind of blocking in a foundation to start with. And really all of these different tones, these swatches down here that we've created, we're not bound to just these. These are just kind of getting us started, a good foundation to begin with. Now keep in mind, and I've mentioned this in the previous lessons, that these skin tones that we've created, these swatches down here at the bottom, they're not the be-all, end-all swatches to use. Everyone's skin is different. So you're going to want to study, study different people's faces, study photographs. Look for colors that are in there that you may not notice at first glance. And that might help aid you in mixing some of your skin tones. So I'm just thinking about some of these different tones down here. Kind of working them in. Alrighty, so we've got our shadow tones kind of worked in. What we're really ready to do now is start blending all of these different tones together, our midtones, our base tones, and our shadows. So let's go ahead and go over to our layers panel and our skin blocking group. Let's go ahead and make a new layer. And I'll go ahead and title this layer Blend. And what I'm going to do now is drag this layer mask up here to this new layer that I've titled Blend. And what we can do is just by clicking on the thumbnail for any one of these layer masks on these other layers over here, just click on that thumbnail, hold down Alt, and you can drag that layer mask and it just basically makes a copy. So clicking on our blend layer, we can be very cavalier in our blending. We don't have to worry about going outside the edges of our face here. So before we blend, let's go ahead and change our brush up. I like using a hard round brush, and so I'm going to go ahead and go to my brush panel over here. Let's go ahead and turn off shape dynamics, and let's go ahead and turn on transfer. And just clicking on that category to bring up the settings, I want to make sure that opacity and flow, both of the jitter sliders, I want to make sure that they're still at 0. And for the control for each, I'm going to make sure they're set to pen pressure. So using my pen, I can control the opacity and flow just by using my stylus. So I'm just going to start blending a lot of these different tones together. Just to kind of start smoothing them out. Once we have everything blended together, then we can start working in some additional highlights and start introducing a lot of additional colors. As I've mentioned before, often a mistake that we can easily make is we take just one color and we just use different values of that same color. And that'll ultimately result in something that feels very flat and lifeless. Now with these different tones, we've worked in a variety of different colors, so we're off to a good start. But we're going to start working in a lot of additional colors. We're going to have a lot of blues and greens and yellows in the face. Now, as I mentioned before, we do have a lot of green, a lot of blue in the face, and this is because of veins in our face that can kind of create that look. And this is pretty evident on lighter skinned people. So I'm just going around the face here, just trying to smooth out and blend together some of these different tones that we've worked in. I just want to kind of soften everything up. It doesn't have to be perfect by any means. We're just kind of trying to soften it all up. So just coming over here to the screen right, just kind of blending these lighter tones in with some of these darker tones. Same thing down here with the lip area. Eventually we're going to start to introduce some reds, some pinks, some purples into the lips to really breathe life into this subject. We have a lot of blood vessels in our face, a lot of muscles in our face that require blood. And so we're going to want to have a lot of reds and pinks in our face to give it life. If you don't have that in there, your subject is going to feel like the walking undead, and you don't want that unless that's what you're intentionally going for. But in this case, we want it to feel like our female is alive. So I'm just coming around here, kind of just smoothing out some of these areas around the nose. And especially over here on the forehead. Let's go ahead and start to blend this. Now, how am I blending this? Basically, you may notice I'm doing it pretty fast. I'm just using Alt and I'm sampling from different areas. Changing my swatches, basically, as I sample. And you'll notice this change pretty frequently over here in the bottom left. And so since I am working with a pressure sensitivity setting now, I can easily blend a lot of this together. Just coming over here on the screen right, starting to kind of soften out, kind of make a nicer transition with some of these tones over here. And just zooming out. I want to make a nicer transition down here at the bottom. And since we do have a backlight, I'm thinking about that backlighting situation. Over here on this side of the screen left jaw. Alrighty, so we're pretty close to having everything blended. What we're going to do in the next lesson is begin introducing some additional highlights and a lot of additional colors, and really just start building on all these different tones, these base tones, midtones, and shadow tones that we've added thus far. So we'll see you then in that lesson. In this lesson, we're going to continue building up our skin tones by introducing some warmer tones and some highlights. So let's go ahead and dive back in. So in the previous lesson, we started blocking in our shadow tones on our face here, and then we followed that up by starting to blend those shadows and those midtones and our base tone all together. So now I'm at a point where I'm really ready to start breathing some life into our female subject here. And we're going to start by grabbing some of our warmer tones from our palette down here at the bottom. So let's go ahead and grab our brush tool, and I'm going to double check in my brush panel over here, and I want to make sure that I still have my settings set to transfer, where I can control the opacity and flow of my brush. Now, you don't have to do it that way. If I haven't mentioned this up to this point, you can always control your opacity and flow up here at the top in your control panel. This is just a personal preference of mine. This is kind of one way I like to work. So I've created a new layer over here in my layers panel, which I've titled Highlights and Warmth. And so this will be the layer that we start working in some warmer values, some warmer tones, and some highlights. So I'm going to begin grabbing just this warmer tone right down here at the bottom, and we'll start working the cheek in. Start really breathing some life in. Now, warm tones can add a lot of life into the skin, like the cheeks, the nose, the ears especially. So you're going to see a lot of reds, a lot of oranges, and a lot of yellows, but mainly a lot of reds and pinks, I think, especially since we're dealing with a lighter skinned subject here. So I'm just kind of starting to build this up, starting to work in some red into these cheeks area. These cheeks are kind of like a fatty area, a fatty part of the face where we get a lot of blood that flows into these areas. So, when you blush or you're embarrassed, that blood immediately starts to race to those areas. And so I'm just kind of thinking about that as I start to block in some of these warmer colors. And we're going to also have a lot of red here in the lips. Now, I do plan to have her wearing some lipstick. I do picture that in my mind. So her lips will be fairly red, I would assume. So I'm just kind of working in some red in there on those lips. And we're going to have some red here in the ears. The ears are kind of a thinner area, a lot of cartilage right in there, and given the right lighting conditions, if we have light shining through those ears, you can kind of see through them. You can really see a lot of red, a lot of pink, that sort of thing. It's kind of like if you've ever held your hand up to a flashlight or a light bulb or a lamp or something, you can kind of see all that blood in your hand. That definitely happens a lot with your ears. So I'm just kind of going around different areas, kind of working in some warmer colors. Let's go ahead and add some highlights in as well. Now, as I mentioned before when I was talking about our tones that we added down here for our palette, when you add light, when you add highlights, you really want to try your best not to use just white because there's a lot of color in light. And so I'm going to go ahead and grab this one right here where I've got a little bit of blue in it. We're just going to see how that feels. Now, as I'm adding these warmer tones, these highlights, I'm not working at full opacity like I was when I added my base tone, my midtones, and my shadow tones. I can kind of start to play around with the opacity of all of these. And with the highlights, as we begin to blend them in and work them in, it's going to allow us to kind of give that illusion that the skin is kind of reflective, kind of translucent. It absorbs light and color underneath that thin layer of skin, and then it bounces them back. It kind of scatters them. So just kind of working in this highlight. Here on the nose as well. And usually on the nose, areas where the skin's pretty tight, you're usually going to have a pretty sharp little peak highlight. So just kind of coming around, working in some highlights here. And I'm kind of liking this highlight that has just a little bit of blue in it. And we may want to grab another highlight that has a little bit of yellow in there as well. And just kind of start to vary it up a little bit. So this is basically a gradual process that we'll be following, just building up our skin tones from this point on. Now, as I mentioned before, the skin is very reflective. And so, as I mentioned in our second lesson, we want to think about the environment, right? There's going to be a lot of those colors in your environment that are going to get pulled into the skin, that are going to get reflected. So we're going to want to bring in some of this green from our environment and start working that probably over here to the screen left of the face. So I'm just applying this pretty lightly, not trying to apply too much pressure. Probably have a little bit in the shadow in there. And maybe over here on the screen right as well of the skull. I may want to start to kind of blend some of these areas in just a little bit. Very nice. Just working in a little bit more green in just some of these different areas. Since we have a lot of red in the face, we're creating a light-skinned Caucasian person, so there's going to be a lot of reds and pinks that show up, and so bringing in some green is going to allow this skin to basically pop. So I'm just grabbing some blue over here in my swatches panel, kind of trying to work that into the lips as well. We're going to kind of have a shadow that's being cast on this upper lip. So I'm just trying to get a feel of how that's going to look. And again, I'll come back down here, maybe grab one of these lighter one of these highlights. And just start to work that into these warm colors that I have for the lips. So I'm kind of liking that yellow that we mixed in there for that highlight. I'm just trying to think about the overall form of the lips right now. That's feeling pretty nice. Let's go ahead and add some color into the eyes. I'm thinking blue would be a nice color. So just kind of working in, grabbed kind of a cyan blue over there. And we'll just kind of start with that as our base color for our eyes, and we'll eventually start to build on that. Let me go ahead and sample that peak highlight just to get those little reflections on the pupil there. So as we begin to add more and more colors, more and more tones to our subject here, to our head, we'll start to begin sampling more and more within the confines of this head, and really start to detail and flesh out our female face here. So in the next lesson, we'll starting to tighten up different areas here. We'll start kind of adding more details and continue working in more additional colors. So we'll see you then.